Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Adam Ward. I'm Director of Studies at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and we are very proud to be co-hosting this event this evening with King's. And in that spirit, I'd like to call on, I think, Dr. Pereira, who wants to make a few introductory and welcoming remarks first. Please.
Thank you, Adam. I'd just like to say welcome. I'm very happy that this conference has begun. We know how much work it was from all of the different partners, all the different organizations and individuals who helped make this happen, especially Denise So my role tonight is to introduce Joanna Newman, who is our Vice Principal for Vice Principal International, so I was going to use the Brazilian title instead of International Relations. Vice Principal International at King's. Joanna was about to be on her way to Rio for the Conversa, a British-Brazilian event that was organized for the 13th, 14th, and 15th of November. Unfortunately, it won't be happening this month, but we hope it will be happening in the beginning of 2016. But Joanna is no stranger to Brazil. She worked at universities UK on the agreement between Brazil and Great Britain on the Science Without Borders program. So she's been to Brazil many times in that function, and now, of course, she's come to Brazil in her new position at King's. So I'm going to introduce Joanna.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Actually, if I had to move from a sector, a national organisation working for government, to a university, it couldn't have been a better move to King's, which has the longest tradition of links to Brazil, and of course has the Brazil Institute. I think it's a brilliantly run. So, I'd like to welcome you, ladies and gentlemen, to this conference, to the inaugural event on international aspects of defence policy in Brazil, which continues tomorrow and Friday at Strand Campus in King's, where we look forward to welcoming you. The conference is a result of collaboration between a large number of individuals and organisations, and Anthony's already mentioned Mrs. Carvalho, who's done so much work, and I'd like to thank him as well. He's brought together, in true interdisciplinary fashion, the Department of War Studies, Defence Studies, and the Brazil Institute. Something we really want to encourage at King's. And in turn, they've invited the various speakers that many of you will hear tomorrow. And these speakers come from many different organisations. They include the Institute of Strategic Studies at the Federal Fluminense University, the Institute of International Relations at the University of Brasilia, the Pandio Calageiros, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, Institute of the Brazilian Ministry of Defence, the Institute of International Relations at the University of Sao Paulo, the Brazilian Naval War College, and the Centre for Military Studies at the University of Copenhagen. So you can see that this is really, truly international collaboration conference. And I'd also like to thank Adam Ward, Chair of the International Institute of Strategic Studies, and Antonio Sampar, a research associate there, for partnering with us on this conference and furnishing us with the splendid surroundings of Bloomsbury House. In addition, I would like to express my sincere thanks for the support of the Embassy of Brazil in London, and in particular, Ambassador Eduardo dos Santos and the Defence and Naval Attaché, Captain Alexander Roselater. Their support has been really essential for this event to take place. And I'd especially like to thank two of tomorrow's speakers, Lieutenant General Floriano Peixoto, Force Commander of the Peacekeeping Mission in Haiti from 2009 to 10, a member of the UN High-Level Independent Panel on Peace Operations, and Dr. Antonio Jorge Ramalho of the Pandio Calageiros Institute of the Ministry of Defence, and the first Secretary General of the South American Defence College in Quito, Ecuador. It's an appropriate day to begin this conference on security and defence issues, since Remembrance Day was originally created to commemorate the end of what was then the bloodiest war the world had ever seen, what we now call World War I. One of the purposes of this conference is to contribute to a rethinking of Brazil's role in the world. Brazil is sometimes thought of as a country that does not project military power abroad, and that therefore does not matter in global discussions of peace and security issues, but of course this is a misperception. Not many people know this, but Brazil sent 20,000 troops to fight in Italy during World War II and lost more than 400 of those soldiers, as well as another 1,500 people who died in German attacks on ships off the coast of Brazil. Brazil is also engaged in an extensive reorganisation of its armed forces and restructuring of its national defence industries under the auspices of the 2008 National Defence Strategy. I'm proud to say that Kings will play a small role in this, as on Friday we will be signing a memorandum of understanding with the Brazilian Navy to enable some of the naval officers to study at King's. Brazil is also a major contributor to UN peacekeeping operations. It has participated actively in these operations since 1947 and sent personnel to missions in the Middle East, the Belgian Congo, Cyprus, Angola, Mozambique and East Timor. In 2014, Brazil looked back on 10 years of leadership of the United Nations Stabilization Mission.
If I speak 15 minutes, it's almost worse
Brazil
than
is
speak at all.
two other UN peacekeeping
2025.
MONUSCO in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is led by a Brazilian general and his staff, and which embodies the idea of an intervention brigade that can engage with armed actors in the region, and UNIFIL, led by a Brazilian admiral in Lebanon. Peacekeeping, therefore, is an important realm of global governance in which Brazil is making a positive difference. And that brings me to tonight's speaker. I cannot think of a person who better represents the capacity of Brazil to make a positive difference to world affairs than Ambassador Celso Amorim, Brazil's former Foreign and Defence Minister, who's been a visiting professor in the Brazil Institute for the last 2 weeks, and we've been working very hard.
Very pleasure.
I think your time in office illustrates that Brazil is not just a spoiler in previous discussions, not just a country that says no, but it is a country that can constructively engage with a variety of different partners, and a country that can say yes. Critics might point out that the Brazilian state uses foreign policy in order to further its own economic and strategic interests, but that is not to say very much because, of course, it's true of all states to a lesser or greater degree. If you look carefully at Brazil's contributions to the resolution of pressing international problems in areas such as trade, climate change, poverty reduction, nuclear non-proliferation, global health, internet governance, and yes, of course, security and defence, then it's very hard to sustain the argument that Brazil is merely a spoiler and not an active and positive contributor to the world's pressing problems. So I'd like to extend a very big thank you to you, Ambassador Celso Amorim, for your generosity in spending time with us here at King's, for meeting with our staff and students, and sharing your experience and knowledge with us. I'd now like to turn the microphone over to Adam Ward, Chair of the International Institute of Strategic Studies, so that we can introduce Ambassador Amorim. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And just on behalf of the Institute, a warm welcome back. We've benefited on numerous occasions in the past from listening to you analyze a number of salient policy issues, most recently at the IISS Cartagena dialogue in Colombia, where you addressed the issue of the scope for cooperation between Asia and Latin America in particular. And I think what has always brought us back to you is a recognition that what makes you a compelling analyst is precisely the fact that you've had this experience of being both a foreign minister and a defense minister. That puts you in a unique position of being able to address this fusion that's required of soft and hard power to establish the correct balance between defense and diplomacy, and to think about the evolution of a national strategy and narrative that is supported then by the resources that are required to bring it into effect. So with that, we'll turn the floor over to you. You will speak for 25 minutes or so. That will leave some time for Q&A, and welcome again. Over to you. Thank you.
Use this one? Yes. Well, good evening, everyone. Of course, I'll skip some of the thanks, but I'd like to thank the IISS and, of course, King's for the opportunity to speak here. Of course, I want to thank also our ambassador, because people have said that I'm longest serving foreign minister in Brazil, but I'm now probably the longest staying guest in the ambassador's house, and so I have to thank for his patience all this time, and of course it's a pleasure being with all of you. I don't want to mention specifically, but I have to mention General Floriano because he was, of course, not only the commander of MINUSTAH and has this important function that was mentioned of the UN review on peacekeeping operations, but he was the commander of MINUSTAH just during and after the earthquake. So it was really one of the most challenging moments that our troops had. Well, let me try to be very schematic, but still bring some reflection. And I think I'll start, well, first, I will not comment on the spoiler, if you allow me, because I have never seen Brazil as a spoiler. We said no to the things that we should have said no, and we think the world is better because we said no to those things. But anyway, but as I would like to very quickly mention this idea that was just referred to, which was the fact, relates to the fact that I was foreign and defense minister. It reflects a perception, I think, in Brazil that the two things are linked. It was not personal about me, but I think it reflects this perception. And I think if one goes through some of the documents that have been issued by the defense minister, especially more lately, like the National Defense Strategy and the new defense policy, and also the white paper that we had published some originally 5 or 6 years ago, but with a new edition more recently, you'll see that this preoccupation is very much present. So much so that I was led to use a concept which of course already exists, and of course, people here are much more knowledgeable than I am on these theoretical questions, but of course all of you have heard about grand strategy. And grand strategy is very much used as a military term in the sense of putting all the assets and all the means that a country has in support of a military effort. When I've been thinking about our defense doctrine and what are the main points, and I must say I'm speaking only on my own behalf. Of course, I don't belong to government anymore, although I hope there are some affinities between what I think and what the government thinks in this area. But especially in the question of defense doctrine, and I think the general will agree with me, this is still an evolving process. I mean, the defense ministry in Brazil itself is a very young ministry. It's only 15 years, so of course the military service has existed for a long time. But so the Navy had its doctrine, the Army its doctrine, maybe sometimes there were efforts for coordinating them, but I mean, not a systematic effort to design a strategy. So this is happening now. So during these 3.5 years in which I stayed, 3 years and 5 months that I stayed in the ministry, I tried to develop a little bit some of the ideas which should be part of this grand strategy. The basic thing, I think, is not to see so much all the means in the case of war, how you use all the means, but how foreign policy and defense policy can be put together to seek for a better integration of Brazil in the world, a better participation, a more effective participation. And I think, I believe that the Vice Principal of King's mentioned the question of the peacekeeping operations and other aspects. And a lot of what I tried to do was precisely to put these things together. I mean, how your defense strategy and your foreign policy strategy not only have to be compatible, because that's basic, of course, but how they can be integrated into leading the country into a better and a stronger participation in the world. Of course, this has to do also with an aspect that was highlighted also before, which is, and I wrote an article with precisely that title, Brazil hardening its soft power, something like that. So Brazil is known by its soft power General Floriano Peixoto was in Haiti. I don't know if you saw a documentary film in which there was a Haitian sociologist speaking about Brazil, and not necessarily all positive, but he was saying, well, you know, the other countries come here with weapons, a lot of money, and so on, and Brazil comes with its songs, with its football, with its nice way of being. He also said, I'm sorry if I'm being politically incorrect, but he said it comes with its beautiful women, and of course, when you see it, it has dominated all the place. So I don't know. I don't think we want to abandon the soft power, none of those aspects. But it is true that in the world that we live, you need also to be supported by hard power. In more than one respect. I don't want to go into all the aspects that are involved here because this is too complex. But I think we have to start with a good analysis of the international relation. And the analysis that is made in defense must be compatible to the analysis that's made in the foreign ministry. And I say that because although if you look into the documents, they are totally compatible, the practices still are not totally compatible. They are becoming more and more compatible, but there are still some differences. For instance, we live now, for sure, in a multipolar world with several centers of power, and in terms of foreign policy, you have tried to use that not only in our own favor, but also in favor of other developing countries, and also, I believe, in favor of peace in the world. And I think in the defense establishment, this kind of perception is starting. Really, there is a difference there. Although, of course, in practical terms, many of the things that we did, we could not have done without the military support. I mean, peacekeeping operations, we are present in Suez in the late 50s, but later on, and early 60s, I believe. But we were also present in Mozambique, Angola, Timor-Leste, Haiti. The Navy has a very important function in the UNIFIL naval task. I mean, we have the flagship of the naval task. The commander of the task force, a Brazilian admiral. When I came to the defense minister, he was still an admiral without a ship, and I thought that was not very much fit. So we made a lot of effort to convince everyone that it was worth to send, and then we have had a frigate, and now I think we have a corvette. How to say it in English? I don't know. I mean, slightly smaller than but still the flagship there. And since it was mentioned here, also in the DRC, we have a Brazilian general who is the commander of the largest and the most robust peacekeeping force with including an intervention capacity. This is not easy. It's not easy to operate these things also intellectually because Brazil has always been very much in favor of non-interference, non-intervention, and how you have a kind of force de frappe. I don't know exactly what was the name in English. I think it was mentioned. I forgot now. This force the intervention force, and at the same time continue to be faithful to our basic principles is something complex. And even Haiti in the beginning was complex. I mean, I remember some 10 or 15 years before, I had been foreign minister, and Brazil abstained on 2 resolutions of the United Nations proposing a multinational force in Haiti. Of course, this time it was different because it was not a multinational force, it was really blue helmets, and also the situation was different. But anyway, these are things that require reflection and capacity to adapt to situations, and that's why we coined the expression of non-indifference. I mean, non-indifference should not be seen as something opposed to non-intervention or even as a qualification of non-intervention. It's just, let us say, a complement. I mean, the fact that you don't want to intervene in countries' internal affairs should not mean that you are indifferent to what is happening in countries where you can help, if the situation so allows, if the UN approves, and so on and so forth. I say that, of course, with great caution, because there is this discussion now going on between the responsibility to protect and its effects many doubts about how it was exercised in the case like Libya. And that's why Brazil, I was no longer the foreign minister, so I can praise that because it happened after, coined a new concept, which is the responsibility while protecting. So that, in other words, like if you're talking to a doctor, don't make the remedy worse than the disease, which I think happened in several cases in which these interventions took place, especially those that were not fully authorized by the UN, or those that were authorized but whose mandate was then changed as things went along. So this is very important. I mean, you have to not only have the initial authorization by the UN, but a continued control by the UN. So, as I say, this is a kind of even conceptually, it's a kind of evolution and digestion. You have to think of the new facts and how we move it along. I have quoted this lady so often I should meet her. I haven't met yet, but she was the head of the planning staff of Hillary Clinton. And I had many disagreements also with Hillary Clinton, but also many agreements when she was Secretary of State, of course. And she wrote an article recently, this lady, Anne-Marie Slaughter, in which I just picked up a phrase which is not about Syria. It's time for all would-be members of the Security Council to step up. And then she mentions Brazil, among other countries. So it's a recognition, in a way, that countries like Brazil, India, South Africa, she mentions also Egypt, but Egypt is in that region, it's Turkey, that other countries can give a contribution to peace and to make things seen maybe in a slightly different way. Well, these are things that have to do, of course, with diplomacy, but it has also to do with defense, and it has to do with the fact that we have the flagship of the naval force in near Lebanon coast. So one thing is very much linked to the other, and I think I spoke about multipolarity, but another characteristic of present world, probably it has been like that for a long time, but now it's even more so, nothing is local, everything is global. And if you go to Palestine or if you go to Haiti, I had the interesting trip from Palestine to Haiti with a small stopover in Rome and Rio, but and you can see places where Brazil can make a difference. And countries like India and countries like South Africa, I mentioned some of them only, can make a difference. And then that has to do with our work in terms of trying to create new groups and so on. But I would say, in any case, that if Brazil wants to have a strong participation in the world politics and the world scene, I was forbidden by someone to use the expression great game, that here has a very colonialist connotation. But I mean, if Brazil wants to be present in this broader game of world politics, the first and most important thing is to keep our region peaceful. And I think this is the greatest asset, which is often not very well understood, that Brazil has. Brazil is a country with borders with 10 other countries, and we haven't had a war in our region for more or less a century and a half. And I think this is invaluable when you compare with any. I don't think there is other comparable situation in the world. I'm not even saying the same, but comparable situation. And that's what makes South American integration, speaking more of South America than Latin America, because it really, let us say, geopolitically, geographically, it's more of a unit. The northern part of Latin America, although we are in Haiti and have excellent relations with Cuba and Mexico and so on, but I mean, let us say it's not so vital in terms of our own situation. And so keeping peace there is the most important thing. And peace doesn't exist without prosperity, development, and so on. So that's why I think integration is so important. I say that because I always hear, especially the Brazilian media, but not only the Brazilian media, many scholars saying, well, and politicians also, I must say, saying that we should make the Mercosur more flexible, allow for separate negotiations by Brazil. I remember 20 years ago it was the Argentinians saying that, now we see the Brazilians saying that sometimes, and I think this is not a good idea, to be quite honest, because I think the most important thing is to keeping the unity of these groups in South America, and because it's not only trade is an instrument. Peace really is the goal. I mean, to be able to live and without the constant threat of conflict is the most important thing. And that's why we worked in Mercosur and work in UNASUR, and we created a defense council for South America. But and now I have to say, and I was defense minister for some time, and it's very difficult to change these things. The headquarters of the Defense Council and the headquarters of the UNASUR is in Quito, Ecuador. Of course, we have a military attachés there who, of course, help the ambassador or do their own work in relation to the Defense Council there. And we have regular meetings of ministers and vice ministers and heads of general staff. But we don't have really many officers. We have, I don't know how many, maybe, I don't want to count, but certainly it's in the tens and or near hundreds in Washington, and we have maybe, I don't know, one or two in Quito. I think so. You have, to a large extent, put your money where your mouth is, and in that question is to put your men and or women where your mouth is. And I think this requires a big effort and a big evolution. I'm not saying to take out the people who are in the United States, in the Inter-American College. They learn quite a lot, and there are many things in which we are evolving and which we have to learn from them, from the United States. I would say, for instance, gender is one in which I think we have a lot to learn from many countries, but especially from the United States, I would say, and there are many other things that we can do together. But of course, our conception of the world cannot be the conception of the time of the Cold War. And Brazil is not in North Atlantic. The problems of the North Atlantic are different from the problems of the South Atlantic. We're a different region, we have different situations. So I think we have to pay more attention to South America and more attention to Africa. And we have been doing that, but very, very slowly in the defense side, I would say. It's very positive that we are able to create this defense council. It's very positive that we created now the South America Defense School, but even the defense school, and I think the appointed director is here, but the difficulties in having this thing resolved are enormous, and I can't understand, quite honestly, if we are able to appoint the Director General or something equivalent of the Inter-American College in Washington, why cannot we appoint the director for the South American School in Quito? I don't know, but somehow the rules there are written in such a way that it makes it complicated, and so we have to do a lot to work on that. So I mentioned very, very quickly South America, Africa, and that, of course, brings into mind also another institution that was not institution, an association that was created long ago, but we are now trying to make more operative, which is the Zone of Peace and Cooperation of the South Atlantic. And I would say, once again, although again we have a lot to do, a lot to learn from NATO and from other places, we want to keep the South Atlantic as much as possible, not mixed up with the problems of the North Atlantic. I mean, we are not seeing it as a defense arrangement against something or in relation to something. Well, so a lot of what I said had to do with cooperation. And one thing that an expression that I always use, that in our continent, we don't have enemies, we don't even have adversaries. So in our continent, cooperation is the best deterrence. We don't need to think of deterrence. Of course, you need some deterrence for if you have armored bands or if you have drug traffickers or whatever, and you have to deal with the borders. Brazil has something like 10,000 miles of borders, almost 17,000 kilometers of borders, so we need to protect that, and that, of course, has to be done, but not against the countries, because the best thing that we have to do with all our neighbors is to cooperate, and also with the countries, the two only countries in South America that don't have borders with us, which are Chile and Ecuador, but they are very close anyway. So this is cooperation. And that's what we want to do. And we want to cooperate with other countries as well in as diversified way as possible. Whenever possible, with a new outlook. We bought, not long ago, in the beginning of my tenure as defense minister, 3 naval patrol boats, but ocean patrol boats. I don't know how to call that in English. Huh? Offshore patrol boats, which are quite robust. Thank you, Ambassador. Quite robust and very important. But normally they would make a trip around Europe, maybe visit one country in the middle and come. So all of them went to trips in Africa, and they make joint exercises with Nigeria and other countries, and of course Cape Verde. And now we have even a small naval mission in Cape Verde. We already had one in Namibia. Well, so this is one aspect on how to cooperate. But we also have to think about some deterrence. In English, I have seen specialists using deterrence and dissuasion, and making a slight difference between the two concepts, which is not very simple because in other languages they don't exist. I mean, in French, I think it's only dissuasion, and in Portuguese, now some people use deterrência, but it's an invention. The Portuguese word is dissuasão. And for some reason, I think deterrence got very much linked to the nuclear confrontation. So I prefer dissuasion anyway. So I think we must have dissuasion, and that's why Brazil also needs to have a nuclear-powered submarine. We need to have modern jet fighters. We need a good system for protecting our borders, and so on. So that's how our soft power becomes harder to some extent. And also, I believe, and I don't have much time, but I want to finish that. I want to say, and I have said, that Brazil is a peaceful country, and that's a kind of a truism, like saying that God is Brazilian or that things like that. But Brazil is a peaceful country. But I think we have to be beyond that. Brazil is a country that has a potential to be a provider of peace. By the peacekeeping operations, as we did in Haiti, I believe with a sort of new mentality, because there were many seminars done on our participation in Haiti to show how the people interacted with the population and so on. But also peace provider in diplomatic affairs. I mean, when we tried to have this agreement we had this agreement between Turkey, Brazil, and Iran, and we had this declaration, which was at the time, exactly in the terms that we were asked to do by some countries, including the United States, and then for some reason it was not accepted at the time. And the same lady, Anne-Marie Slaughter, so that's why I have an admiration for her anyway, in spite of the fact that she had been the head of staff, of the planning staff in the Secretary of State, wrote an article towards the end of 2011, I was already in the Defense Department, saying when the pressure for the United States to do something, and do something at that point meant maybe bombing, she said, well, maybe it's the time for us to have a look again in that agreement that the Turks and the Brazilians had proposed. Well, I don't know if I cannot compare the two agreements. They're very different in many respects. But what we showed then, I think, and I think that was in the back of people's minds, is that it was possible, that a dialogue was possible, and provided that after you would be able to verify what we did. So this is one example of Brazilian presence in the world, which, of course, this is soft power, but in order for you to be heard, you need some hard power as well sometimes, and that's what I think we have to do in terms of deterrence, besides the other tasks, of course, that our armed forces perform in Brazil, like protecting the borders, protecting our coast, and so on. So all that said, I would just to finish with a comment, because again, coming back to the article that I mentioned in the beginning, saying that it's time for all would-be members of the Security Council to step up, maybe it's time to reform the Security Council so that these countries can really have a real influence in the decision-making process. And I would say that was not, of course there is, I won't hide, of course there is a matter of prestige also, that all countries that would be candidates would enjoy that. But I think it would be good for the Security Council because you can find also more possibilities of negotiation between, let us say, extreme positions either of the West or the East, to simplify very much a complex question. So this is time. I don't know when it will happen. Of course, it's very complicated because the United Nations has a charter, which is the equivalent of a constitution in a country, and we all know how difficult it is to change a constitution, except in Great Britain, I think, because here your constitution is customary, so it's it's not unwritten. Well, in most other countries it's written, and it's very complicated to, and the United Nations Charter is also written. So. And this is very complex, procedurally complex problem. But it has to be done. In the meantime, while as long as this doesn't happen, I think some evolution has to take place, that more countries participate in the decisions, or at least in the discussions of peace and security matters. And I'm very glad to see, because I exposed this idea some years ago to some people. At the time it didn't fly, but now apparently it's starting to fly, because I see that in the next G20 meeting there will be a discussion on terrorism and security and maybe immigration, which, well, how can you separate now the terms? How can you separate development from immigration and immigration from security? It's very difficult. And we see, I mean, I'm now part of a commission that's dealing with Ebola and how to avoid or prevent the effects of pandemics like, well, Ebola didn't become a pandemic after all, but I mean of diseases like Ebola. And I see people say, oh, I have to take this subject to the Security Council. Well, it's not like that, because you need to have a representative Security Council in order to deal with these questions. So I think this would be an important step forward to make a world a little more balanced. I would not say that would be fair, but a little more balanced. And I think if we make the world a little more balanced, there is a good chance that we can make it a little more fair as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good, thank you very much. We have some time for questions. If you want to make an intervention, a concise intervention, get my attention, and when the microphone reaches you at that point, for the benefit of our speaker, even though you may be known to me, introduce yourself. But let me just kick off. I was very struck by your usage of the term grand strategy. You know, this is a classic term. It's a great power term. Histories have been written of the grand strategy of the Roman Empire. The term is used quite liberally in the US these days. It's used in China, but in China it's only used to deny the fact that they have a grand strategy, because their ambitions are other, as we know. In the UK, when we had an empire, we used to have a grand strategy, but since then we aspire to something called joined-up government between the various ministries. It's something much more modest.
More bureaucratic.
So I was wondering, for a term like that, what level of ambition do you think needs to be attached to it? Because this also then plays back to the question of resources, and we are in a time of austerity. You mentioned South Atlantic, you mentioned Africa, you mentioned South America, but you also alluded to interventions of the kind that you and Turkey pursued over the question of Iran. So do you think that more extroverted, problem-solving approach is what Brazil needs to be doing and performing, in addition to the more permanent and constant priorities that it will want to pursue in its immediate vicinity and in places like Africa, to which it has very particular connections? And if so, where are the issues that you want to make an impact? What are the problems that you want to solve outside of that immediate area?
What are the problems that we want to solve?
Within the limits of the level of ambition your strategy should set itself.
To solve all. It doesn't depend on us only. No, I think Brazil has been a global player in things like trade for a long time, It has become a global player in questions like finance, and it's not my judgment, it was the judgment of President Obama when he said that the G20 became the primary forum for discussion of financial terms. And I think we can be a global player also in questions of peace and security. We have been to a large extent. Excuse me speaking about myself, but that's my experience.
That's what you're here for.
Well, no. When I was ambassador to the United Nations, I chaired 3 panels on Iraq, actually with great support of the UK by the time, because the situation in the Security Council after the so-called Desert Storm operation had become untenable. It was impossible. The Russians would say, whenever anyone would raise any subject, the Russians would say one thing, the Brits or the Americans another thing, and the Chinese, and it was totally paralyzed. So I could see there that in Brazil, it fell to me that I was the president of the Security Council when we had this situation. So my big effort was to put the Security Council to function again. Not only to solve the Iraqi question, which was very complex, but at least to insulate it and to allow us to deal with Angola, with Ethiopia, Eritrea, Timor-Leste, and so on. So, make a very long story, the shortest possible, because the time you allotted to me is really very short, we were able to create 3 panels on Iraq, in which I saw myself in one occasion, actually, I wouldn't say chairing, but coordinating a meeting of the P5, because they would not accept anyone else to coordinate. Of course, the Russians would accept the Chinese and vice versa. The Brits would accept the Americans and vice versa. The French probably would not accept any one of those. So they asked us to ask actually me, because I was the person, and I could see that our voice was heard. And one day also, at the same time, I was in a vacation in Greece. Everybody needs a rest from some time. And at that time, it was very calm and everything tranquil in Greece. So I was there, and I received a call from the then president of the Security Council, the ambassador of Japan, Isashi Owada, who after became a judge in the International Court of Justice, saying, well, Celso, I'm calling you because we want Brazil to be the chair to occupy the chair of the Sanctions Committee. The Security Council has the Sanctions Committee on former Yugoslavia relating to Kosovo. So, but why me? Why? I mean, so, no, because Brazil is the only country that's accepted both by Russia and the United States. That's not a simple thing. That's something that has to do with a part of our soft power. I think, of course, I have tried you ask a very broad question, how we will solve all the problems. I don't know. I think we can contribute to solve the problems with an approach that is, let us say, sensitive to needs of developing countries, that can see the importance of democracy and human rights, but also see the merits of non-intervention, of being careful, or if you have to intervene in extreme cases, that you have to be careful, that you have done that respecting the rules, not changing the mandates in the course. In the case of Libya, frankly, to speak frankly, not only change the regime, but to change the mandate. So it's no wonder then when a situation like the one in Syria appears, some countries say no. So the memory was there. So I think that countries, not only Brazil, I mentioned Brazil, Brazil, India, and others can do that. Can you do that only with soft power? Probably you can do something, but I think it's less effective. And certainly we need to have a degree of deterrence or dissuasion in our own region that can protect us. This is a discussion in Brazil itself, because as you said, it's austerity. It's not only austerity. Brazil is a country which is a developing country with many needs. It's a very unequal country, which is probably the most profound problem that we have. And so why you need the defense? Why you need the fighter jets? Why do you need these expensive submarines? Well, I don't know. In the Second World War, we were not involved in the beginning, actually, but our ships started to be, sunk, and, we were drawn into it. And so I cannot exclude Brazil and South America in general is very rich in natural resources, it's very rich in fresh water reserves, very rich in biodiversity. And I don't know if there is a conflict between country A and B. I don't want to nominate them, but that's not impossible. They may be tempted to do something which is not nice. So we have to have the capacity. So people say, well, but you'll never win a war against country A or country B. But it's not a question of winning a war. Deterrence is in my opinion, or dissuasion better, it's a question of doing sufficient harm that someone will think twice between there. Especially nowadays, in which you have television, when body counts become very important in internal politics. It's very different from what it was during the time of the Second World War. I read one of the biographies, of the many biographies of Churchill, Winston Churchill, the one by Roy Jenkins, which actually is very good. Yes. And you see today our ship was sunk, there were 300 men inside. It's not more or less normal. Now, nowadays, if 10 bodies come, that's already something for someone to be very careful. So that's what dissuasion means.
Great. Yes, please, here in the second row. Just put your hand up to the microphone. Yes, just look to your right. There we go.
First of all, Minister, thanks very much for coming to us in London. I hope you see London still as your second home. And thank you very much for your remarks. I wanted to ask you a little more about the neighbourhood as you spoke, South America, and particularly with Africa. I suppose it's no surprise with your enormously long Atlantic coast that you should have an interest in Africa. And I was struck when I was in Brasilia, what you do, for example, in training in the Namibian Navy, for example, which is probably not well known. You are a very key player in that. But how do you see the defence component to the relationship Brazil has with these countries? They are important neighbours. What role can defence relationships play in furthering the overall relationship Brazil has with Africa?
Thank you.
Should I?
Yes, please.
Yes. I think it's very, Africa is to many countries. It's in a way more complicated than South America, even, and of course we have the Atlantic in between. But I think they have a lot to gain. The case of Namibia that you mentioned is a case in point, because many people in the Namibian Navy even speak Portuguese nowadays because they were trained in Brazil. And we are starting, actually I was astonished that we didn't do it before, but we are starting a mission in Cape Verde, a micro mission, I would say, in São Tomé and Príncipe, but this is the start. And we have very special also relationships with other countries. And I think this probably will be good. I mean, we have to be more present in one another, and we have received many people for our schools, actually. I went in all the graduations of the commencements, I think, of the military schools. I was very happy to see that there was an important number of people from South America, Central America, but now all from African countries as well, and Lebanese actually, in the naval school or naval academy. I mean, if you would call, for the first time, Ramadan people had to take into account of Ramadan because we had people from Lebanon there. Isn't it true? I mean, yes. So I think this is something that goes like that. That we create. I mean, all this is very idealistic, you may say, but you have to be idealistic to get somewhere. So long ago, we created this idea of the zone of peace and cooperation of the South Atlantic to differentiate very much from the North Atlantic in a way. In our view, it should be a denuclearized zone, a zone free of nuclear weapons, not only nuclear weapons, but also weapons of mass destruction. And we have worked with that aim, both politically and now also with the defense establishment. And again, I have to make, it's very obvious that in the South Atlantic it's more natural that the Navy is involved. We had a very important, it was a start of something very more concrete, because until now it was just very general. But we started, with a seminar on maritime surveillance. I don't know exactly what's the precise term, and we did that in Salvador, Bahia, and all of the the African countries in the West Coast came to it. So this is how it works, you know. With Angola, we had a more ambitious plan, actually industrial, even to build there some patrol boats, not as big as the one that we bought from you, but the 500 tons patrol boats. But we had to suspend that because the lowering of the price of oil made it difficult for them to implement. But it will come someday. So that's a very general comment because I can't say many more than that. I was very happy, for instance, to see, going in the contrary sense of what I said in the beginning, and it's a positive thing, I was very glad to see the number of Brazilian officers of colonel level, more or less, most of them in Argentina. There were a great number in Buenos Aires, actually more than Argentinians in Brazil. Well, when I said that to the Minister of Defense, it's proportionate to the population. I don't think it works exactly that way, but anyway. But it's very good that there is this understanding. I mean, our relations with Argentina are crucial for us. And the fact that what I said always, we try to do in South America, is what Karl Deutsch used to call a security area. So a security area is an area in which war becomes a security community. I don't use the word security community because it got other connotations in Brazil in the past. But I mean, it's a peace and security community, so to say, an area in which war is inconceivable to solve problems. Of course, we are not yet there, but if you see how, for instance, UNASUR worked in the conflicts or the differences between Venezuela and Colombia, even sometimes this was the Defense Council also, but in the other case, in the political level, even an internal conflict in Bolivia, UNASUR was called to make so there are many things that we can do, that we can do, and I think they are not limited to our continent. I don't mean that we're going to send troops to necessarily. It must be in places where we can make a difference, when we can actually work. But I believe that we already expressed at some point, at least, that we could even come to with ground forces in Lebanon. And I believe even in Syria, we are part of the forces of observers, and we only took them away when it became impossible to stay.
Thank you very much. Yes, sir. Here. Second row again.
My question is...
What's your name first?
Yes.
Sorry. My name?
Yes.
Matheus Souza. I'm a student in strategic studies, University of Verde. My question is, you talk a lot about soft power, so the importance of soft power and how Brazil is good for soft power. In my opinion, soft power is a very powerful weapon that you can use. It's not a lot of countries that has embassies in all countries of the United Nations. That's specific kind of capability. My question is, how can Brazil use the card of diplomacy, for example, in the fight of terrorism or the...
Yeah. Okay.
Oh, again, a complex. Let me make a correction. We have relations with all the countries in the United Nations. We don't have embassies in all of them. But it is true that we have a lot of embassies. For instance, we have more embassies than Britain in Africa. Now, that's what I understand, which is something, in a way, might be a little bit astonishing, but it's compatible with the fact that a great part of our population is of African origin, among other things, apart from the Atlantic and so on. Well, I was not praising soft power. I'm just saying that's part of the reality. Some countries have more than others. The United States is a big power and has a lot of soft power as well. I mean, through the films, through many other things, and so does Britain. I mean, there's so many Brazilian students here. That's part of soft power. Soft power is like the old phrase by Monsieur Jourdan in the Bourgeois Gentilhomme when he wished to learn literature, and it is explained to him what's the difference between poetry and prose. And after the explanation, he said, "Oh, what? Que belle chose, je parle en prose." So That's beautiful. I speak prose. So soft power is something that you discover you have as you are doing it. So it's not like saying, well, let me increase my soft power now. It's it is not like that. But you have, I think Brazil, for many reasons, and Brazil has many problems, as I already mentioned to you, including inequality, which we made big steps in the last 15 years or so, but there's still many steps to take in that direction. But Brazil has, I felt internationally, what enabled us to participate, I believe, in some negotiations, and that's true in trade, it's true in disarmament, it's true in environment, because the negotiations, actually, they are very similar. I mean, the subjects look different, but the way you negotiate is very similar. And I think the Brazilian diplomacy, and I think the Brazilian military, I must say, and I'll mention one episode, have a capacity to understand other people's thinking. Because if you don't understand other people's thinking, you don't negotiate. You just try to impose or you lose. And that's I mean, we never said, and I hope we'll never say that we are in the right side of history. History has no right side. I mean, maybe there is a right side that can be seen 1,000 years from now, but I think it's the simple idea that you are in the right side of history seems to me so arrogant that makes any negotiation impossible. So Brazil doesn't think that way. And so that, I think, it helps. Of course, as many other countries, we have many religions and many races and many things, although there are inequalities also in the racial areas, there are in other areas. But that's basically what I would say.
Well, you mentioned that term, and it brings me back to the United States. I think to most outside observers, it seems fairly obvious that Brazil and the US should have a better relationship than in some respects that they do. When I first went to Brazil, it was explained to me that the problem might be that they're too similar. You know, they're big countries in their region, they're immigrant societies, they post-colonial societies, they have a certain perhaps sense of themselves as a force for good in some ways, a degree of exceptionalism in their national narratives. And so they were a little bit too similar to be very close, somewhat like the French and the British in some respects. But without rehashing the whole history of US-Brazilian relations, which no doubt are troubled in many ways, if looking at it now, it seems that there must be areas where interests do practically converge. And if you had to prescribe a program for, really strategic cooperation between Brazil and the US, looking at the situation that we're facing here today in the world, where do you think most progress should be made and is actually achievable in investing this relationship with some real strategic content?
Well, many people will speak about subjects like investment and trade, and I agree, I don't disagree. I don't think we can have a free trade agreement with the United States in the terms that they have been putting in the past, because it, for instance, it created difficulties for us to use our generic drugs, just as an example, generic drugs to deal with questions like HIV/AIDS. I mean, just to give an example. Or it prevented us from using the power of the state to do government procurement and use it as an industrial policy mechanism. Of course, you can be against industrial policy, but I mean, I'm personally in favor. So I think these are the kind of to develop technologies and so on and so forth. So, but having said that, of course, there's a lot that can be done in trade and investment services and so on, and I think it's being done. Actually, we have a very important trade with the United States. It's our second partner. The first is China. But I don't know, I haven't seen the latest statistics and now, because the exchange rate has changed a lot, these may change as well. But until last year, I think the United States had with Brazil the second or third largest surplus it had in the world. I mean, it was Australia and Brazil were the two big countries. The others were countries like Hong Kong, which is not actually a country, or countries with all due respect, but which make an intermediary role. So it was really Australia and Brazil, which were the two big countries which had big deficits with the United States. So I think that a lot to be done there. But I would think that, and I think there has been a growing recognition by the United States that we can be partners not only in our region and help solve problems. Well, let me tell you, I mean, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, when we had a problem in Venezuela which seemed intractable, Brazil led the creation of a group of friends which included the United States, strange as you may think, and we were able to convince President Chavez that we needed a group that was not only the friends of Chavez, but also friends of Venezuela in general, and that they needed people that talked to him, but also people who talked to the opposition. So this is a kind of thing that we did, and I mean, I had innumerable dialogues with the American officials in that respect, and I mentioned this in my book, so I don't, although they're only in Portuguese, but I think I hope someday some of it will be translated. And so we started I don't know how it's called because it was already after my tenure, global dialogue or something, global strategic dialogue with the United States to deal with these broader questions. And actually, when I mentioned the Tehran Declaration, it was, let me say, because many people heard that already, but many haven't, it started with a request by President Obama to President Lula saying, more or less the following: I reached out to Iran, and Iran didn't correspond. And he spoke about the nuclear field, of course, and then he said, and I need friends who can talk to people that I cannot talk to. And that's why they asked us, and then Turkey also got involved in that process. And the agreement that we came, the Tehran Declaration of May 17th, 2010, in all the operative parts, is exactly what was asked from us. Exactly what was asked from us, not a difference. Of course, the rhetoric, we had to make some concession to Iran, but that didn't matter. I mean, we're taking 1,200 kilos outside of Iran, putting in Turkey, and doing that immediately. So these were the main points. So I think this kind of thing, we can be helpful.
Great. We will take a round of 3 questions all at once. The lady here in the front, you in the second row, and the gentleman right at the back. Keep your hand up, please. Yep. Back row. Yeah, please.
Thank you. I'm Leon from Leiden University in the Netherlands. And one thing which I've been wondering for the last year about the South American Defense Council and how far, I mean, nothing to do with defense, but the fact that Chile, Peru, Colombia, and now the Pacific Alliance, and now recently you have this Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is always a way of the United States directly or indirectly to divide a bit. Strategy is always to divide. What impact would that have on the South American Defense Council?
Okay. We'll take them all at once, if that's all right.
Okay.
Then you.
Hello, Mr. Bushman, Latin American Military Capabilities Analyst at James. My question relates to the defense budget.
I'm sorry, I have to see you, otherwise I can't understand.
So you spoke about the strategy of hard power being complemented by soft power. So
Please, can you just say it again slowly?
Sorry. So you spoke about the strategy of hard power being complemented by soft power.
Mm-hmm.
My question relates to the current budgetary situation. So since the hard power is currently being struck by significant austerity measures, such as significant delays to procurement in strategic projects. So isn't this going to have negative effect on Brazil's international involvement and Brazil's soft power? And is therefore the involvement going to be held back after all the brigades in Lebanon is being sent back and complemented by offshore patrol vessels during technical issues?
I'm not sure I understood the gist
It's basically,
of the question.
the gist is about the relationship between cuts to the defense budget and Brazil's international role.
Okay.
And then the gentleman in the beige.
Sorry, it's my problem, it's not your problem.
Please.
Thank you, Minister, for your talk. My name is Fernando Molona. I'm a PhD candidate between the University and King's College. I have one question about two topics. First of all, I would like to know how Brazil deals with, now that it's passing through economic crisis, global economic crisis, to sell to the local population Brazil ambitions and spending so much money in these initiatives when there are problems, domestic problems. And the second question is regarding the lack of support of other South American countries to Brazilian candidacy at the United Nations, principally Argentina and Colombia.
I'm not sure I understood that, I'm sorry.
Your question was about the support that Brazil is getting from South American countries in pursuing its... The lack of support. Okay.
For the reform of the Security Council, you mean?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Well, our friend from Leiden, I mean, one of the most traditional centers of study in Europe. I even learned, I don't know if that's a fiction or if it's autobiographical of the author, but in Gulliver's Travel, he studies in Leiden. He made his studies in Leiden, and he studied it in High and Low Dutch, it was said, so, which was a very interesting thing to see. Well, I think the thing I don't like in the Alliance of Pacific is the name, to be quite honest, because alliance gives the idea precisely of what you were saying, of division, that we are going in a different way. In reality, I think that, to be quite honest, I think the IISS is very fond of the Alliance of the Pacific, so I should not be saying that here, and so is The Economist and maybe the Financial Times, I don't know, because in a way they are more liberal economies in the sense that the United Kingdom, or most people in the United Kingdom, have defended. I'm not criticizing, but when you say, and I hear, oh, Brazil should be more dynamic and make more agreements with the Pacific Alliance. First, we have free trade agreements with all the South American countries of the Pacific Alliance. We have had for a long time, or not a long time, but for some time, for it was 2005 more or less when these were finalized. All tariffs will be zeroed in 2019. So there is already this. Second, the trade of any of those countries with Brazil and Mercosur is much bigger than with the other countries of the Pacific Alliance. So I think it's a bit of a media thing. The countries, if they want to do things together, it's fine. But for instance, in Mercosur and even UNASUR, you have the freedom of movement. When I went to this seminar in Colombia, I met a Brazilian journalist who was very happy that he was able to come only with his ID card, without a passport, to Colombia, which is not member of Mercosur. It's member of the Pacific Alliance. So maybe, I'm not sure, but I'm not sure if a Mexican go to Colombia can go, or vice versa especially, if they can go only with the ID card. Probably not. So, what I'm saying is not only trade for trade sake alone, but trade also for maintenance of peace and unity. And it's a long road, and it's a bumpy road. And there is this song, The Bumpy Road to Love. That's it, the bumpy road to peace. It's a bumpy road. It's not an easy road. But I think it's the road that we have to tread. And I think, generally speaking, of course, I think we can do more with these countries. And even towards the end of our tenure there, and I think that continued, we tried to have services agreement with Chile and services agreement with Peru. Brazil is proposing now a new type of investment agreement which doesn't have a clause which is unconstitutional for us, which is the enterprise towards against state investor clause. So so we are having agreements which are more for investment promotion and opening market for investment, but without that clause. And we are doing with actually did with Mexico recently. We came with one with Mexico. So I think these are things that we can do with these countries. And there are many other things apart from defense in which we are working very strongly. And I don't think it's being undercut at all. Actually, the Secretary General of the UNASUR is a Colombian now, and we had a Colombian lady who was the first. So I think even in Colombia, which let us say was the more reluctant country in the beginning in relation to the Defense Council, not in relation to other aspects, things are going pretty well. And I think we are increasing our cooperation, even in industrial things. We have common projects, for instance, of a naval river patrol boat with Colombia. So I'm optimistic in that regard. I think it, to a large extent, is a media thing, this thing of the Pacific Alliance. And there is a difference, of course. There are countries that have less complex economies, and I think they have different options. That's why it's difficult to come to a customs union with them that we have with the other countries of the Mercosur. It's difficult for anyone to live with cuts in the budget, but you have to look at these things not like a photograph, but I mean, I was involved in film doing, so you see it cinematically, so and if you take a longer term, you'll see that the investment in defense in Brazil has grown in absolute terms and in relative terms in relation to the total expenditures of the ministry, and that's a very good thing. And I mean, as far as I understand, I'm not in government now, so I don't follow the day-to-day. I know there are problems, and some projects are being, let us say, extended a little bit, but Brazil goes on with the problem of the submarine, the program of the submarine. The president just reaffirmed recently about the jet fighters and the armored cars and things like that. I mean, maybe the general, when he speaks, will be able to say more about that than I say that right now. But anyway, of course, I think it's damaging. But what can you do? I mean, it's part of the reality. I don't know. If you ask me if I were the finance minister, what I would do, I don't know. I don't know. But it's difficult. You have to make choices. It's the old butter and cannons. Yeah, cannons. So, and of course, I think that's. I think it's a transitory period, and I think we'll go through that. And I think if you take that, say, the tendency for the 10, 12 years, 20 years, you'll see that the growth has been very impressive. And not only the growth in investment, but also the facilities for the Brazilian industry to invest in that. Well, on the Security Council expansion, well, I don't know. We have had support of several countries in South America in different moments. I would say that you have to wait for the moment in which the game, you know, there was a famous football player in Brazil called Didi. He was then a trainer of the national team in Peru. And he was one of the biggest players, best players we had in '58, the first World Cup that we won. And whenever there was something that people were criticizing him in a training exercise, and said, well, training is training. The match is another thing, you know. So let us wait for the time when it comes, because I don't see some countries voting in favor of the reform as such. Maybe they abstain. I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball. But I think the situation is much different. I can tell you, I'm speaking because I have written that, so there is no problem, it's public. I have seen, for instance, Argentina, which is the country in which there was more rivalry. Most of the politicians that I've met don't have that view, that it is more a problem of the foreign ministries of the two countries. Of course, this is influential, but I think when how do you say that, when push comes to shove, yep. I think they will not prevent, my impression. But push has not come to shove yet. So, is that all?
That's all, yes, that's more than all. Thank you very much indeed. We'll have to bring the formal procedures to a close here. I'm sure there'll be lots of additional questions for you in the reception which follows this event. Thank you very much for what I thought was an incredibly compact but rich tutorial on Brazilian foreign and defense policy. And I think if you're leading this charge to amalgamate the two, that's something that some of us in other countries need to emulate more closely as well. So thank you for that too.